Olá, pessoal do BlockTrends, bem-vindo a todos a mais um Block Insider. Hoje eu estou aqui com o Jason Somensatto, Head de Public Policy na Chainalysis para a América do Norte. Vamos falar um pouco sobre stablecoins, sobre o cenário nos Estados Unidos, sobre o cenário das stablecoins, dos ETFs e alguns assuntos a mais, bem importantes para saber, se inteirar sobre o mercado de criptoativos, né, criptomoedas, no país que é a maior economia global, né? Esse podcast aqui é um oferecimento da ByBit, né? Temos também nosso portal para você que queira saber mais, que queira se informar mais, uns cursos mais completos. Caso você queira assinar, dá uma olhada lá, o QR Code está na tela. Então, Jason é americano, a nossa entrevista será em inglês, mas a gente vai colocar legendas na edição. Vamos começar? Hi Jason, how are you? How did you become the head of the public policy in Chainalysis? How did you enter in this market? And what is Chainalysis?
Yeah, I'll go back even further than that just because it's really nice to be on here since I am the son of a Brazilian. My father's from Brazil, so this is great. So I have been working in the crypto ecosystem in some form or fashion for almost 10 years now. I started off as a lawyer focused specifically on some of the financial regulators and what issues they may have with the crypto ecosystem back in its earlier days, and have had a few other jobs as in kind of the legal field before. In 2021, I joined the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is a U.S. government agency, market regulator that oversees usually the market for derivatives, but also plays an important role in the regulation of cryptocurrency trading. And I worked there for almost 3 years, working specifically for the chairman of the agency in handling all matters related to cryptocurrency. So that could look like engagement with Congress as they wrote potentially new laws related to the regulation of cryptocurrency trading, to working with other agencies in the US government like the SEC, like the Treasury Department. I joined Chainalysis about a year ago now to lead up their policy engagement here in the United States and in Canada. And have been doing that for about a year, and yeah, it's been a great run.
And first, I like to ask the most obvious question. I think, how's the regulation scenario in the US? Because I think lots of things changed in these past years, in these past months. A lot of presidents, candidates are now embracing crypto markets, right? So, how it's going on a regulation scenario?
Yeah, I would say it's complicated. I would say, yes, a lot has happened, and also in some ways, not very much has happened. So in the short term, like in just the past few months, there has been a lot of political momentum around, in particular, Congress passing new laws that would create a new regulatory structure for the cryptocurrency market. This is something that has been talked about for quite a while and worked on in various ways over the years. But importantly, in the last few months, what you've had is a vote, specifically in the House of Representatives, that would implement a bill that gets called FIT 21 is the shorthand name, but that would essentially divide the cryptocurrency trading market up between the SEC and my old agency, the CFTC, for regulatory oversight. That bill still would need to pass the Senate, the other house of Congress, and then be signed by the president. And so there's a lot of excitement. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but there is a lot of momentum towards seeing a big change in the regulatory environment. At the same time, it is not clear whether that legislation is likely to pass the finish line. There's a lot of people working hard to make that the case. But there's always politics involved in the US, and particularly during a presidential election year. And you've seen, as you referenced, in particular, the Republican candidate for President Trump, candidate Trump, trying to advocate on behalf of crypto voters, in part to, get them aligned with his vision. But all that being said, it's still unclear to me exactly whether you will, one, see a kind of new regulatory regime put into place, two, whether the presidential candidates really care about this. And in some ways, at least from my perspective, you probably don't want this to be too politicized. You're trying to pass a market regulatory structure that kind of fits for both sides so that it's not a political football that goes back and forth. So yes, there's been a lot of excitement and discussion, but in some ways, the industry is still in the US in the same place it's been for the last couple of years, with a somewhat unclear regulatory environment in which it operates in, and without kind of oversight by a single federal market regulator.
And what did you think the ETF approval meant for the regulation scenario? Because we all know this shaked the crypto market in price action, but in the regulation scenario, that changed anything? Did this change anything?
I think in some ways it did. So from Chainalysis perspective, our tagline is building trust in blockchains. And one of the things that we try to do is work with trusted institutions that want to interact with the cryptocurrency space to help them do that in a safe manner. And I think it's probably one of our theories that what needs to change is probably a level of adoption and acceptance by certain types of actors in the ecosystem that are willing to lean into things like compliance and maintain certain standards, and to see crypto more integrated into certain traditional financial instruments like an ETF. And so what you have with the ETF approval is, in some ways, that continued sophistication and growth of the ecosystem overlapping with the kind of traditional financial world, and frankly, putting products out there that people want to invest in. And you've seen the response in terms of investor interest in those products. And so I think it is, I'm not sure how much it's changed all of the regulatory dynamics, but I think it is a good test case for the fact that crypto assets can be responsibly integrated into parts of the regulatory structure in a way that hopefully protects the customers and the investors, that are engaging in these products, while also leveraging, some of the parts of the traditional financial ecosystem that are frankly helpful to, expanding the market and whatnot. So it was an important milestone and a reflection of kind of further maturation, which I think was probably more important because it signaled that the SEC was not going to continue to try to take every other asset other than Bitcoin and call it a security. And so it kind of raises the question of, okay, where's the line of other assets that might be able to be put into ETF type structures?
Yeah, I was going to this point. Now with the ETF spot, this changed everything. But we like it or not, it's a subject question that the market already had answered. The regulation is far behind. Can I say that? It's far behind the market. So what's the next step? We have so many so many technologies that needs to be answered to by the SEC. So staking, Ether staking, it's using a security movement. You have to sue the exchange who offers these, like they did with Coinbase. So what's the next steps? What do you think is the next steps on this scenario?
Yeah, I think first you're correct that kind of the pace of innovation is so rapid and it's difficult for the regulators to keep up. One of the roles that I played when I was inside the government at the CFTC was as the acting director of an office that we called Lab CFTC, which really the whole purpose of that office was to engage with kind of the innovators in the ecosystem and to inform the agency internally on the level and the types and the speed of innovation that was going on. And I think it was always a strong view of mine that yes, regulation is going to constantly have to try to keep pace with this innovation. And I think one of the things that has been difficult for me is to see different regulators probably take a different view as to how much should they even give credence to this area as to whether they should adapt at all. And like you said, the market's been kind of moving without them. In terms of the next steps, I think it is, listen, in an ideal world, in my mind, there would be some market regulatory structure in place in the US that was, if not custom built for crypto trading markets, at least recognized the unique nature of how crypto assets trade and move, and that would allow for, one, regulators to kind of get themselves up to speed and have direct oversight over these markets, but also presumably bring some level of clarity and predictability to the market participants operating in this space. That to happen at a federal level, I think it's pretty well accepted that would require some level of congressional action, in the form of new legislation. And I think one of the tricky dynamics in the US is that Congress is, politely not very effective these days. It's not passing many new laws. It's having trouble coming to consensus as to what should be the law of the land on any topic, but including the regulation of cryptocurrency. That being said, even in the absence of some of that activity, I think you're seeing regulators. So the one that I think of is the New York Department of Financial Services, the NYDFS, has built out the bit license regime, a regime that is specifically meant to license companies that are operating in the cryptocurrency market. And that has been, it's taken a while and it's a slow process with regulators, but that has built out some considerations for what is new in this space. I think if you're not going to see legislation as the next step, the kind of other thing you need is to see agencies like NYDFS to progressively try to keep up. Otherwise, I worry that the industry will continue to operate in a way that takes advantage of regulatory arbitrage between agencies, or takes advantage of or leaves the US entirely in a way that's not, it's not conducive to customer protection, to market integrity and any of those things. So the truth is the next step is just the continued sophistication and engagement by regulators in this ecosystem, whether that comes through legislation or whether that comes through state activity is kind of remains to be seen.
I thought you were going to say that the next step is the SEC looking for DEXs, right? Because they sold the Uniswap just a few weeks ago. So,
I will say, as somebody, so before I was at the CFTC, I worked at a company called 0x Labs that was, in the DeFi space before that was really a term. And so I, know the unique challenges that those people operating in the decentralized financial space face. But yet I also know from the government's perspective, the unique challenges that they present. And it is a really hard problem of okay, we're used to regulating markets in a certain way. And in some ways, the crypto ecosystem has, exchanges and brokers just like any other market does. But the DeFi ecosystem presents a very unique manner of, trading and interacting that I'm not sure like I even have the best view as to what is the adaptation, if any, needs to be made to the regulatory regime to address that, right? A little bit depends on like what that ecosystem continues to look like, but I agree it's a huge question mark.
And I think going a little bit further on our podcast and touching the stablecoin subject, but also staying on the regulatory scenario, I think myself that U.S. have a huge problem on their hands, right? Because they want to, and they have to regulate stablecoin issuers like Circle, like Tether. Okay, that's fine, but Tether right now have more bonds than Germany. So how they will regulate some private company who is acting in the country who has more bonds than a country, So how they will do this?
I think you said they have like a huge problem on their hands. I also think it's probably a huge opportunity because, to your point, I think any single company that is holding a lot of U.S. bonds, that there is then an inherent interest in the United States, playing a role in how that company operates. And I think, not to kind of harp on the need for legislation and like regulatory structure, but one of the other pieces of legislation that has been going through the process inside of Congress relates specifically to building out a regulatory infrastructure for stablecoins in which they would be regulated by the prudential banking regulators. And I think this is like a really important bill because, to your point, the stablecoin ecosystem right now is highly dependent on US dollars, right? And the convertibility in and out of US dollars. And so, one, you have these companies that are holding a lot of US bonds and other US dollar denominated assets that are kind of, at a big enough level that it's meaningful to some extent to the US economy. Two, you obviously have a strong demand for stable coins, right? I think in Chainalysis data, one of the things that we've seen, which I don't think is shocking to anybody who's familiar with the crypto ecosystem, is that the volume of activity in the crypto ecosystem is now primarily in stable coins, right? Yes, Bitcoin and Ether are the largest assets by market capitalization, but something along the lines of like 55, 60% of all volume transacted is in stable coins. So you also have a demand on behalf of the market to use stablecoins as kind of the currency of crypto networks. And, the opportunity sits there for the US to have kind of unique insights into that market, to have unique touch points if they regulate those companies, to make sure there's some level of like financial stability with respect to like those bond holdings, but also make sure that customers are protected so that there's not a run on these entities to remove all these reserves in a way that the federal government doesn't have some level of insight. And so I think stablecoins present the most kind of pressing issues to what you said, but also like probably the biggest opportunity to have regulation kind of help the US crypto market in this respect.
So you said we have a huge volume of transaction of stablecoin transaction among the blockchain network, right? I thought this was happening just in Latin America, where we were worrying about the inflation and all of these things. In the US, they use a lot of stablecoins too, and for what?
I think it varies. I mean, I think one of the things, so I do a decent amount of policy maker engagement, and I think one of the things I try to explain is that the way an asset like a stablecoin gets used can vary a lot based on jurisdiction, right? So for example, there is a decent amount of investment activity in the crypto space, right? Particularly now, as we were discussing earlier, in like decentralized financial protocols and whatnot. And so I think amongst market participants in that area, stable coins are kind of the primary way that people put their money into DeFi or transfer funds between exchanges for trading, right? And so it plays this settlement layer role in a investment speculative trading environment in a place like the US. At the same time, right, the stable coin can play a inflation hedge role in certain countries where the demand is, different, right? It's not crypto trading at high speeds between exchanges. It's, how's a way that I can hold my wealth and maintain that dollar value in a manner that, can't be seized by the government. And then there's also the potential for remittance corridors, right? Where this is an easy way to move dollars between countries and the like. And so I think, I don't have the answers as to exactly what each country is using stable coins for. And it's a little bit difficult to discern that always from the data. But I think what we see is kind of this meaningful level of product market fit for stable coins, a variety of use cases. And so hence the kind of need to build in the infrastructure that makes that as safe as possible.
Something that I think it's funny, it's the whole world uses stable coins, right? And they are backed by US dollar. So, and the US is printing money, like the whole rest of the world, of the central banks world. You would say they are exporting inflation because, like or not, they are, sending dollars, sending the dollar through the private company that backed the stable coins all over the world. So, how do you see any impact of this in the world economies?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess, in my mind, the way that I think about it is that with enough time now for the development of this ecosystem, there's kind of space for a lot of different narratives and asset types. And so, listen, if you want a 21 million coin capped, neutral layer with no government intervention, there is Bitcoin for that. But I think what is interesting is to the extent that you are looking for mass adoption of some new payment rail, right? That a lot of average consumers, aren't making that calculation of, the same philosophy that a Bitcoin maximalist might bring to it. You're seeing, that desire of yes, the dollar might have the inflation concerns that people are but it is more stable and more reliable than any other kind of asset class that, people might want to hold or transact in. And so I guess I'm just encouraged to see that the crypto ecosystem is maybe diverse or broad enough now to manage both of those use cases. Now, I think from a policy perspective, they raise different questions, right? Like I said, if stablecoins continue the adoption curve that they're on, it is important that, we figure out the way to, because they are kind of the equivalent of a US dollar payment network. And I think the US does have a strong interest in being able to oversee that type of activity. Whereas, if you want to move Bitcoin between wallets, or if you want to trade it in speculative, the policy issues that raises are different, right? Those, we see the market trading in Bitcoin and we think of hey, there should be market regulation. Long way of saying I personally am not, some Bitcoin maximalist that worries that hey, Bitcoin is the only hedge on inflation that we have to survive the coming economic apocalypse. But, there is that environment that you can operate in this ecosystem as well, if that's your view.
And how many of these transactions today are being crime related? It's an important thing because a lot of people think that crypto market is all about crime, is all about financing terrorism, but I think that is falling, right? I think that is reducing. So
yeah, I just don't think it's as simple as everybody might want it to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the truth of the matter is, so we put out, at Chainalysis, we identify certain services operating in the crypto ecosystem, including illicit services like, scam shops and ransomware actors and sanctioned entities. And we obviously track and help the government and private sector trace those transactions. And when we look at all of that data in an aggregate level, we put out an annual crypto crime report. And so like what you saw for 2023 is when we looked at all of the funds flowing into wallet addresses that we've identified as illicit, the total number was about 24 billion, which is a meaningful number, right? When you're talking about trying to, you want law enforcement to be sophisticated and to be able to operate on that. You want compliance offices to be in the position to look out for illicit activity. At the same time, that 24 billion into illicit wallets makes up, less than 1% of all total transaction volume that we, that we observe on chain across several different blockchains. And so it is clear that like the vast majority of transactions aren't, at least based on our data, illicit in nature, right? It's a lot of trading activity. It's, people holding assets as an inflation hedge or as a safe haven asset away from maybe their country's asset. It can be a lot of different things. But what is clear is kind of like the amount of illicit activity that we identify is a meaningful amount, but it is a small percentage of the total activity occurring in the space.
I didn't understand one thing. The Chainalysis does count the tax evasions or in US or outside of US as crime data, or?
That's a good question, and that is probably like our estimates of total illicit activity are always going to be a little bit on the lower bound estimate because it is directly attributable data. We're not making speculative guesses. We're not doing like sampling and then extrapolating as to the total amount of illicit activity. The numbers we are reporting is the direct numbers from our data as to entities that we've identified as conducting illicit activity and the amount of funds received into those. There are categories like tax evasion and stuff that I don't think are easy for us to be able to, like, one, we don't identify individuals in our data. So, it's not like we say, hey, each of these 7 people didn't pay their taxes. And frankly, that would relate to information that is off-chain, right? Like, what did they file? What the types of illicit categories that we identify are when we have kind of directly attributable evidence that the wallet controller is engaged in some illicit activity. So that might look like information provided to us from law enforcement that certain wallets are engaged in, romance scams or some kind of investment fraud schemes. It might take, it might be Treasury identifying that certain wallets are going to be sanctioned, right? So actually, if you look at our 2023 data, the lion's share of illicit fund flows that we identify actually relate to sanctioned entities. And specifically, a large chunk of that can be associated with one exchange in Russia named Garantex that the Treasury Department sanctioned and, still gets used pretty frequently. Now, how would you describe each of those assets? Is everything involved in that illicit activity? In some ways, yes, the Treasury Department has said, like, you're not supposed to engage in transactions with that entity. But it could also represent, like, local Russians trading Bitcoin, which, doesn't have the same illicit categorization of, for example, North Korean hacking groups stealing funds from a DeFi protocol. But that's a long way of saying it can be very complex as to what gets included in our number. But there's some things like tax evasion or categories that like would depend a lot on creating a case with off-chain data that doesn't get reflected.
Mm-hmm. So which assets they are using at the moment? Which assets are the most used? Is it Bitcoin? Is it Monero? Is it Tether?
So, I mean, generally, I go back to the most used assets in terms of transaction volume is stablecoins, right? And the two largest ones of Tether and Circle comprise the vast majority of that marketplace, but with some important challengers also coming up. In terms of certain categories of illicit activity, you see certain assets being used more than others. So, for example, ransomware actors, who are demanding a ransom on behalf of some like cyber attack that they've conducted, will not request payment in stablecoins because they know, that those can be subject to seizure more easily probably than other assets. And so you see ransomware actors prefer Bitcoin over that. Now, at the same time, it's interesting because like I'm sure those entities probably would love to receive some of the privacy tokens, but some of the companies that facilitate those ransom payments will usually not agree to pay in a privacy token for, kind of those concerns. And that's one crime asset type, right? If you look at another form of illicit activity, you might see a very different form of asset being used. For example, like, interaction with sanctioned entities. They might be entities that relied heavily on stablecoins until they were sanctioned, whereas in other categories, you get a lot more Bitcoin. So it varies over different crime types. One of the things I can say is generally, though, is consistent with stablecoins being kind of the majority of the market activity for all purposes. We have also noticed in our data that it is the majority of assets that end up at illicit addresses. I think a lot of that has to do with, again, the sanction category being so important, but an interesting observation.
I'm curious. I don't know if you are allowed to explain that, but how the investigating has done, do you have software, on-chain analysis software, analysts looking all the time, 24 hours per day at several addresses? How this works? How you guys?
To try to put it as like succinctly as possible, you're not far off, right? We are ingesting all of the blockchain data, from the blockchains that we support into our platform. And then we are overlaying that with information that we have on attributing specific wallet addresses to particular services. And that information comes from, we have a large team of analysts and investigators internally who validate that data and say, yes, these wallet addresses belong to exchange XYZ, or these wallet addresses belong to a ransomware actor that we saw operating and communicating online. At the same time, we also get information from our customers, right? So from the private sector customers that integrate our technology and from the public sector entities using our tools. And then what that allows for is for investigative units in the public sector and compliance units within entities like exchanges and other service providers to basically, get real-time alerts as to, for example, an exchange might analyze all of the incoming crypto to its platform, so any transaction sent into it, and it would analyze to what extent those assets have been exposed to illicit wallet addresses in the past. And it might have certain alert settings that go off that then compliance officers will take a look at and determine, is this a suspicious activity that we either need to report to the government or maybe ask more questions of the customer? And similarly, from the government's perspective, they might get a tip or, a victim might come forward and say, hey, my crypto was stolen. This was the wallet address. And then they would kind of follow those funds through our data and see which service it ended up at. And maybe it ended up at an exchange, and then they could go subpoena that exchange for the information of the person who brought those funds there and maybe get a lead on their investigation. So the kind of workflow of how people use our data can vary. But I think importantly, so recently there was a court decision in which reliance on our data was challenged by the criminal defendant who was being charged by the United States Department of Justice. And they said, hey, you can't rely on Chainalysis data, it's unreliable. And the court wrote a 30-page opinion explaining basically a little bit like how we do our work, how governments leverage our data for these investigations, and then finding that that is a reliable method and that can be used as evidence in trial. And that was an important development for our company because it kind of validated this process by which we collect this data and we provide these tools to the government. But yeah, there are, particularly in certain sophisticated parts of the government, very sophisticated and knowledgeable law enforcement investigators who use our platform to, track very complicated money laundering schemes using crypto or track North Korean fund flows in cryptocurrency ecosystem.
So later I'm going to ask about the Lazarus Group because I think it's fascinating. I think it's really fascinating. But now I'd like to ask, now it's a tricky one because I was wondering, okay, I'm not a criminal, I'm Leonardo, I'm using cryptocurrency, okay, to transaction between me in a friend and a friend. But Chainalysis or any other company, analysis company, are using my data to investigating something. So how LGPD works on blockchain, because either or not, it's public. All the information are public. So how does this work?
In terms of like how we view like an individual user and like how they should feel about this like public data being available, you're saying, or?
Yeah, because this data is available, and on chain you can't relate it to me, but if you look at the data and tracking until the exchange or exchange deposit, you'll see my name, my identity, my everything, and you know how much I have, how much I transaction per month, per day. So where's the LGPD in all of these? How is going to be any law about this? No?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think from my perspective, I think that there's this balance, right? There's this balance between how do you leverage this transparency to get after bad actors or to make better compliance procedures at these companies versus, how do we ensure that there's some level of privacy for individual actors? I think it's important to note we don't trace and don't attribute individuals in our data. So we don't say, hey, this wallet belongs to Leonardo, and everybody now knows it that uses Chainalysis, right? We attribute services, right? Whether that be illicit or an illicit service. And then ultimately, particularly from the investigatory perspective, we, yes, you might have an investigator inside the government who is saying, I'm looking for this individual and I'm going to track their movements. And there it's important, right? That you have kind of the right government system in place to make sure that, somebody isn't abusing that system. I think it's been interesting to watch, right? Because the crypto ecosystem itself has also tried to develop certain privacy elements. And in some ways, even transacting on an exchange provides some level of privacy because the transactions generally occur off chain and are, now you're sharing your information with the exchange. But so it's a long way to say, I think there's a balance there. I think, the way that we view our data, again, it's kind of the publicly available blockchain data. We're just looking at like service level iterations. And usually the nature of the information we're able to give to like law enforcement is very much just in the form of like leads. Like this would, if you are investigating a case, this might be the platform that you want to go to ask them if they have information that they can share on a customer that you have some suspicion about. Or, you're tracing certain funds and you want to see where they get offloaded at the end of the day, you can kind of follow that. But I think it is important, right, also to ensure that there's kind of limitations on, you never want people to abuse that data and stuff. And so I think we're, right now we've seen a fairly, I think the use cases that we've seen of our data, particularly by the public sector, have been generally positive, right? Like it has helped track down, I think like $10 billion in assets seized from people who are stealing, from, terrorist groups, from a lot of illicit actors. But it will be interesting to watch kind of the development of both the technology and the government regulation of it to see what the right balance is between privacy and compliance and transparency.
I just asked because I keep a track of the Chainalysis work, and you guys do such a great work. You are effective. But you helped to investigate in several crimes. So I really appreciate what you guys doing. But I was just aiming to know in this regulation perspective. But moving forward or backward, actually, I said I was going to ask about the Lazarus Group, right? So what is the Lazarus Group? How they emerge in this crypto market, what they do?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I should start off my answer by saying I am by no means an expert. We have people internally who are experts in this. But I think at a high level, there have been, hacking criminal groups that, the US government and other kind of reliable sources of information have affiliated with the government of North Korea. And they have been active on a lot of criminal fronts. I remember listening to some podcast about, the Lazarus Group doing kind of a concentrated or coordinated heist of all these ATMs, completely un-crypto related, several years ago. But they have identified crypto markets, I guess, as a weakness in terms of particularly like operational and cybersecurity around some of these assets that can be exploited to obtain a lot of funds. And so we have seen instances where, the Lazarus Group or groups affiliated with them have, conducted hacks of exchanges, of DeFi protocols, pretty sophisticated level attacks into the crypto ecosystem, and stolen over $1 billion worth of assets, a good amount of assets from various protocols, from various exchanges, and have used sophisticated means to move those assets around to try to obfuscate attribution to them. So we've seen them use mixers. We've seen them, split transactions up in thousands of different ways to leverage exchanges in jurisdictions that don't have much compliance infrastructure to offload those assets. And it's, a real, and this is what I was saying earlier in terms of the total amount of criminal activity in the crypto ecosystem, can be measured in a smaller percentage of the total activity. But it's a very real threat and a very meaningful threat to have, at least for the US, a government that is so adversarial to the US, be able to extract so much value out of the crypto ecosystem. And I think the solution to that is, it's numerous, right? It's kind of better cybersecurity and processes at some of the companies operating in this space. It's, more sophistication by the government in terms of tracking and getting in front of some of these assets. It's, making sure there's regulation at some of the off-ramps, particularly in jurisdictions that are not used to being integrated in kind of the financial system, to make sure, that they can serve as somewhat of a barrier so that it becomes less of an obvious target, right? Because I don't think anybody thinks it's good, but it is pretty wild, the sophistication and the unique nature of some of their attacks. I mean, again, something I'm not directly familiar with, but I've even recently there's been stories about North Koreans who interview for jobs at crypto companies as a way to be kind of like an insider attack vector, which is wild. So
we are going to the final of our podcast, but I'd like to ask now for the final question. We started this episode with optimistic view, right? Kind of optimistic view on the scenario regulation. So we are going forward. The regulation is advancing. Okay, a little bit, but the regulators are embracing crypto. But now we saw these Lazarus groups, and what's the worst thing that can happen? I don't know. Now the US just, we don't like crypto anymore. We're going to ban mining, just like China. What's your view? What's the worst thing that could happen right now in the US scenario, regulation scenario?
I'm not sure what the worst is. I think going off your last point there, one of the things that we say at Chainalysis a lot, and we have a lot of conversations with various policymakers throughout the world, is that bans do not work, right? Your idea that hey, just don't use cryptocurrency, that cat is out of the bag, right? There is something intriguing about this technology. There has been enough development of the infrastructure and the build out of these networks that it is clearly that there is going to be an ecosystem of people using blockchains to transfer value. I think probably the worst thing that could happen is that governments in some ways, just want to turn their eyes away from it, say it's all bad people. They want to punish the good actors who are trying to use that ecosystem. And what is left is an environment that is very internally adversarial, right? It's just criminals, it's people stealing money, it's scam artists. It is that reality that some people have in their head that it's only used for illicit purposes right now. I think all that will do is hurt those people who want to engage in that ecosystem. One of the things, even this is included when I was in the government, is at the agency that I worked at, we were very straightforward in saying regardless of your views of the crypto ecosystem, you're going to have to, policymakers, regulators, lean into figuring out what is the right model to bring this marketplace into the regulatory infrastructure. I don't want to be dramatic and say that if legislation doesn't work out in the next year, or if regulators don't change their tunes in the short term, we're going to see some drastic consequence. Again, I think there's a pretty strong foundation for an industry that wants to engage in this. But I do think shunning knowledge or understanding of this ecosystem only leads to worse outcomes. So
the worst thing that can happen is few years ago all over again, basically.
In some ways, right? You had people with $8 billion in assets on a platform have to sit through a bankruptcy, and why is that ever a good result, right? All you're doing is taking it out on the customers who want to engage in that, and that's not the right.
Do you want to add something to?
No, I think this has been pretty comprehensive. I feel good. This has been great conversation, Leah.
So, Jason, thank you for your participating in our podcast, and hope we are going to see very good news about the world's regulation, about the governance embracing crypto, right? And thanks for coming.
Yeah, we shall see. Thanks so much for having me.